Welcome, folks, to the 102nd episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. I'm your host, Mark Hasara, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation. I love airplanes, as you can see here behind me. On the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we interview some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, maintainers, aviation enthusiasts, aircrew members from all over the world. We want to hear their stories, but more importantly, what did they learn from being in these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even general aviation environments? The purpose of our show: how does the aviation world work? But more importantly, increasing critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. A lot of the stories that you're going to hear on the Lessons from the Cockpit Show are being told here for the very first time. And again, today's one of those days. We're talking to a maintainer. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit Show is brought to you by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are really detailed and highly researched profiles of your favorite aircraft, 4, 6, and 8 feet, printed on vinyl like the one you see here behind me, 8874, my airplane in Okinawa, Japan. Or we do custom ones too. There's a particular airplane that you absolutely love. You'd love to have your name on it from a particular unit, tail number, even weapons load for modern jets. We can do it for you. So go to wallpilot.com. Please subscribe to the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, or better yet, become one of my Patreon members on the All Ranks Club. Those of you joining at the designated driver or the by the bar get special access to me, Q&A sessions via Zoom. We also do a virtual bar night. And I've got some pretty cool 7-inch stickers, like you see here on the back of my computer. They go on water bottles, any flat surface. That particular F-15 was the wing commander's jet from Desert Storm and has meat kills. They're really highly detailed, all right? So please go by my Patreon and join my All Ranks Club. The link is below. If you just want to support the show, I've put my PayPal and Venmo below also. And just contribute to the show. I appreciate all of you that have contributed so far. We're doing very well on YouTube right now, which has been great for the show because basically everything's paid for now. Today on the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we're talking to a maintainer. She wanted to be a maintainer ever since she was in college, and she did so on Strike Eagles and tankers. Today we're talking to Angelina, call sign Strike Stevens, and she's going to relate to us some pretty incredible stories and maintaining the airplanes during some very critical operational phases. So grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in. Let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, episode 102, with Angelina Strike Stevens.
Angelina Strike, how are you today? Welcome to the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. Thanks for being on with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well today and so glad to be here with you.
I'm really looking forward to this because I've not had a lot of maintainers on. I've had like 2, and this is going to be great to hear from your perspective of not only tankers, but fighters, and doing it on a very international scale. You know?
Well, as you know, I had to tell you that if you want me on Lessons from the Cockpit, my cockpit time is on the ground, other than a couple of very short exceptions. So, I really appreciate you wanting to hear that perspective because it's not always the one you get, and maintenance is my love for my time in the military.
But see, the flyers couldn't fly without people like you.
That is true.
And that's why I always say both in the air and on the ground. How does the aviation world work both in the air and on the ground? Because we couldn't do it without the ground personnel like yourself, okay? And handling all the all the beep, squeaks, and breaks that the pilots, hey, this is broken,
Oh yeah. Yep. So, absolutely. No, I appreciate it. And I love being able to talk through those stories and provide that perspective.
Good. So how did you get your love for aviation?
So that is always a tough question because I was not one of those people that grew up saying, I'm going to be in the Air Force, or this is exactly what I know, I'm going to do someday. I did grow up, I grew up with a bit of a turbulent childhood, but my dad, one of the things I was able to do growing up, my dad would take me to the Reno air races. And I
Oh,
loved,
oh,
I loved the air races. I loved airplanes, but I was always very mechanical. And I loved the engineering, the design, just the how do you keep something like that going and taking it apart, putting it back together. I was as interested and still am in the engine torn apart on the side as the airplane itself. And on the flip side of it, because of how I grew up, I craved, when I was coming out of school, I craved structure, stability. I was always encouraged to chase my dreams, but I also learned that hard work was the only path to create the kind of life I was dreaming about.
mhm.
I was working 3 jobs as I was paying my way through college and going to ROTC. And something I realize now, as I look back on it, is that the military was this great equalizer. It didn't matter if you had an Ivy League education or the money you had or your background. Everybody came in with the same shot and able to step onto an even playing field, which is really incredible to me. And it honestly changed my life. I will never forget the moment I got my first paycheck, and we still got them. It wasn't a check, but everything was paper. It wasn't all email and computers at this point. And it was one job, and it paid rent on my own apartment and all my bills every month. And I had health insurance for the first time in my life. And that was, I mean, I stood there and I got emotional just looking at this paycheck and going, that was it. And I don't have 10 other jobs trying to make ends meet. And I, through that process of school and going through ROTC, aircraft maintenance was my first choice. I actually turned down and avoided being put in for a pilot slot. I loved the idea of flying, but to me, work and my purpose in life, I wanted to be with that team in the trenches. And that to me is what military service was all about. And being able to help carry the load, help create an environment where the people I was working with could thrive. And sometimes when they let me, because as an officer, you say the flyers couldn't do it without me. It's for the people that I worked with and for. But occasionally they'd let me roll up my sleeves and throw on a set of coveralls and get my hands dirty. And that just felt like where I was meant to be. And that decision remains one of the best decisions of my life. Maintenance, flight line, generating sorties, and the back shops, the bomb dump, that is in my blood, and I miss it every day.
God bless you and your children's children strike. Because I know when I came out to the airplane, some of my crew chiefs were out there like 3 hours prior in not what we would call real friendly weather.
Oh, no,
you know, and
rarely.
and getting an airplane ready to go was a lot of work. And there's one crew chief strike I'll never forget. Vonnie Peterson, the first night of Desert Storm, flying 8019, an old A model. And I just asked her one question because she was that good. Vonnie, is the airplane ready to go? I didn't even look at the forms. I just said, Vonnie, is it ready to go? And maintenance folks like you that have that kind of passion for it, the pilots don't have to worry about that aspect. And I didn't, because I knew that airplane was ship shape because Vonnie was the crew chief. Thank God.
I love that. And I love when you can see those relationships and that trust that are built between air crew and maintainers. And it goes all the way back. I've worked, a lot of my time is on back shop and down in the little rooms and vaults and shops that you really never get to see. And when we can get them out there, seeing that and talking to air crew and building that relationship across the complex, it can be a very special thing because many aren't always appreciated for what they do or their contribution. And they are working day and night just to get that one sortie off the ground. And it means as much to them. And it's really cool when you can see that appreciation from the air crew side as well.
Well, and you know what, Vonnie asked me, what are you guys doing tonight? It's the opening night of Desert Storm. What are you doing tonight, Captain Hasara? And I said, Vonnie, your airplane's, God, this makes me emotional. Your airplane is going to make Air Force history tonight. Your airplane is leading the 3 ship of tankers that is refueling the first Wild Weasel package into Baghdad. And she just beamed. And she's walking around the airplane. She's got this big, huge smile on her little freckle red-haired face. And she loved hearing about what we were doing. And I even showed her my lineup card. I said, Vonnie, here's what we're doing. Excuse me here again. She passed away about 6 years ago, unfortunately.
Oh gosh.
But again, the maintainers want to know, hey, what are you guys doing tonight? What is it you're doing tonight? And I loved walking around the airplane telling Vonnie, your airplane is going to make Air Force history tonight. And that was the kind of relation. And she was from Kadena too, so that helped. She was one of the crew chiefs on one of the airplanes that we brought over. So, but how in the world did you get a call sign strike?
So the call sign, I know in the aviation community, call signs usually come pretty early in your career. In my case, it was well into my career. So I spent 7 years of my career at Mountain Home Air Force Base in the gunfighters. And I had spent something like 11 years on the F-15E Strike Eagle. And in 2018, I was able to come to Mountain Home on my second assignment there and be a part of the 389th Fighter Squadron T-Bolts as the director of maintenance. And it was an experimental construct. Maintenance and ops were directly integrated in ways that we hadn't been in a very long time. It was a really hard year. We faced the kind of challenges that tear most teams apart. And we had to find ways to come together and grow and learn if we were going to thrive as a team. And up to that point, I had spent a decade in that community, but under a different chain of command. And it was different. And our operator counterparts brought maintenance into those fighter squadron traditions in ways they hadn't been before, and that included naming ceremonies. So at one of my last events with the squadron, one of my good colleagues and coworkers with Victory Strategy, Casey Campbell, she always says all fighter stories start with "there I was." So there I was in the presidential suite at Caesar's Palace on a TDY to Vegas, dressed as Hawaiian Elvis. I was a really old lieutenant colonel with a bunch of lieutenants. And most of those stories stay in Vegas, but the layers I'll share. And if you know fighter namings, you're not actually there when they tell all the stories and embarrassing things about you. They actually do that while you're in another room, doing whatever ridiculous things they have you doing. And the layers that they shared with me, first off strike, at the time, they said I was the oldest and longest tenured maintenance officer that had ever been on the Strike Eagle. So that's the obvious one. They said that I would strike to attack problems and overcome obstacles. But as you know, ops people don't always like the process of that. So they said they also wanted to go on strike from the meetings I made them do to attack all the problems. So those were the basic layers.
But it stuck.
It stuck. It did. And I was able to do some work later in my career with some working groups on mental health, wellness, a lot of volunteer team stuff. And we found taking away the rank and the status helped us have more real conversations. First names are uncomfortable, call signs worked and made people feel more comfortable. So through some of those efforts and my time after that assignment, it stuck, but it means a lot to me. That was a team in a year that taught me a lot about myself as a leader and helped me grow and just helped me see what it could look like when you broke down the barriers and just really worked together as a team. It was an incredible experience.
And your team at Mountain Home was big at that point, wasn't it? I mean, that's one of two of combined wings, if I remember right, in the United States Air Force at the time.
So Mountain Home is an interesting place because I've been there twice during my active duty career. I actually live on Mountain Home Air Force Base now. My husband threw me a curveball after my retirement and got orders back to Mountain Home. So I am back at Mountain Home physically. I can hear jets flying overhead right now. But yep, sound of freedom in the background. But yeah, Mountain Home is a unique beast because it has multiple squadrons, always has. It was a composite wing way back in the day, but it was simple. That also made it a really good test bed for experimentation. And so through the years, it's been one of those places where if they're going to try something new, and in my second assignment there, we tried a lot of new. My first assignment there, it was a bit more simple. It's not a base that has, as much of the reserve and guard component or other complexities or multiple wings. It's a fighter wing and it has some uniqueness to it. I personally, my first assignment there, over my career, I have more flight line time than the norm. My first time coming back to Mountain Home, I was actually coming back from RAF Mildenhall. And one of my old bosses, at the time I was way too old to come back and lead a flight line maintenance unit, But I had an old boss who brought me back because my experience in the fleet to help a unit that was struggling. And I got to spend nearly 3 years with the 391st Fighter Squadron Bold Tigers. And, we were going through major modification. We were going through supply chain challenges. We went through sequestration. Then we had to reconstitute from sequestration, and we had a Pacific deployment. First squadron to fully integrate in the RIMPAC exercise from the Air Force. And then we ended up out in Osan, Korea at a particularly turbulent time. The base construct is simple, but what they ask us to do and what the challenges that are thrown at Mountain Home because of it, because it's such a pure construct, are pretty significant. And the fleet faces challenges. And that first assignment taught me a lot. When I came back those many years later, as I mentioned, I was an old lieutenant colonel, and here I am coming back into a fighter squadron. I was definitely too old to lead a flight line maintenance unit, but we were experimenting. An old colleague of mine, Flash Oak, now retired as well, hired me to be his director of maintenance. And that was before I went into command in maintenance, where I was able to spend time, in the back shop and really culminate my time in the Strike Eagle community, commanding back shop maintenance, and got a chance in both assignments to work with our Singaporean counterparts. So an incredible element of Mountain Home is that we have one of the Singaporean squadrons here that is integrated with U.S. leadership along with Singaporean leadership and integrates in our exercises and training. And it's a pretty cool thing to see that element. And it still is a pure part of being a fighter wing without other mission types, in the mix. It's pretty incredible to see all that come together and get to work with those international partners as well.
And see, Strike, people don't realize how complex the Strike Eagle is.
Yeah.
With not only the systems that it has on board, which they're adding to now, and of course you've got the F-15EX that's coming off the line, but just the Strike Eagle, the E models, I remember refueling them for the very first time when they were just showing up at Seymour during Desert Storm. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most complex fighters that there is in the inventory, with the radar, the weapons, the pods, the new pods that they've added to it. You've gone from, just for instance, the Lantern pods to the sniper pods, and all the upgrades that go along with that. Joint helm mounted queuing system, as they add those things, what does that do to the maintenance and the supply chain? Talk about that for just a minute, because this is a really fascinating
Absolutely.
story.
I mean, the evolution of the Strike Eagle fleet across the board has been an incredible journey to be on and to observe, but it is challenging and complex to take an airframe that is a legacy platform and keep it at the leading edge of tactical and strategic advantage, which is what they've done with the Strike Eagle. When my first Strike Eagle squadron was the 366 rockets, in 2007, 2008. And we came back from that deployment into a gauntlet of upgrades that were these suited upgrades that we felt like, well, this is it. This is going to be, we're going to go through this surge. We're going to modernize this jet, and then we're going to go back to normal. And that surge of upgrades has maintained its pace since that time, since really, 2006-07 when we started, and, probably before that with some units. And it's not just one thing at a time. You're having to stand aircraft down and put them in this case, they do a lot of contract lines where they're doing a contract modification, and you're at the whim of contract providers ripping jets apart, in some cases nose to tail when it's involving systems that are integrated across the actual airframe. And your manpower, which is intended to and manned to, support sortie generation, is now stripping people away to go rip apart a jet for these mod teams and to help try to put it back together and to do the testing and the validation before we bring it back into the fleet. And oh, by the way, we're still being asked to fly the same number of sorties. So that integration across functions, not only, your back shop, your bomb dump, your flight line, your ops, your logistics, your support, all of those things add just this gauntlet of contract modifications into the mix. And it changes because all of a sudden you have a JHIMIX, you have a this, you have all these things that then there's, putting in these other elements to make sure that it is an integrated platform. When you look at the mission set, 20 years ago to today, and how much has been piled onto the air crew, the maintainers, but in that case, the air crew, to stay proficient and stay on top of, we're not a CAS platform, but when we went to Afghanistan, we were flying CAS, and suddenly we figured out what that meant for the jet, for the wear and tear on the jet, and doing things that it wasn't used to. And then we pivot to every theater, every conflict. It's one of the first ones called on, and it's overwhelming, but it is an incredible challenge that community has stepped up to. But it is a beast to manage when you look at, for me, it's those pro supers, it's those master sergeants, those seniors that are managing something that we take for granted. The complexity of all these different elements of leadership and management that they're having to weave in to kind of spit out the final answer of, do I have my 10 jets for the day, 12 jets or 14 jets? It is incredible what we ask these people to do. And for the Strike Eagle fleet, it has been especially challenging because of the continuous modernization. But it's also something everyone in that community is incredibly proud of, because it is still at the tip of the spear. It is still one of the first platforms called on in any conflict, because it's ready and they keep it ready. And it's plenty of challenges to do with that, but it has been quite the journey, that's for sure.
I interviewed Spliff Russell, Chris Russell, Spliff from Lake and Heath. And he said the first time he and Panzer shot the gun at a ground target, the very first time in their careers, they were putting bullets down 80 meters from the good guys on top of Takargar Mountain during the Battle of Roberts Ridge. And obviously to jump into that role, because now you're hanging different bombs on it, and that's the one thing about the Strike Eagle, as you well know, Strike. Mm-hmm. There are so many weapons that you can put on this platform, and it's got a long station time.
It does.
We're only refueling it like every 45 minutes, and you'll have GBU-12s on one side, CBU-105s on one side, AMRAAM, Sidewinders, the Dragon, I think it's called Dragon iPod on the center line. All of these things that make it such a lethal airplane. And of course, you as maintainers, where do you keep all those parts? How do you keep that supply chain going?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you touch on the supply chain is one thing. You touch on, and I'll get back to that. We talk about maintainers, and the crew chief is the first face that comes to mind. But when you mention the munitions challenge that is levied on the Strike Eagle, what that does to your ammo troops, your weapons loaders who are looking at those fusing challenges and how to be ready when all of a sudden you are so multi-role that you're doing too many things at once, and trying to navigate and have those conversations with your ops counterparts to make sure that they're going to be successful, because the complexity of, a multi-load, with different fusing and different, we don't know what we're going to have to do, so we want to be ready for all the things. That has been incredible, seeing the growth in our munitions community, both the ammo and the weapons loaders, and how they integrate with our weapons officers, to be able to solve those challenges and be ready for those challenges when you don't even know what it's going to look like and what's going to be asked of you, because the expectation of the platform is so, again, it's jack of all trades, and it's going to be ready to do all the things. So I think that's a huge piece of it. Supply chain. I mean, I never truly appreciated the depth of that complexity until I found myself in staff jobs where I was managing and leading efforts that had to do with supply chain, and also went down a rabbit hole and was working with the Intel community on supply chain vulnerability. But as a maintainer at the core, over the years, the challenges to supply chain and our ability to have what we need, whether it's just the basic spare parts or looking down the road at predictive analyses to make sure that you're ready and you're ahead of the curve, which they're doing a lot more now with modern technology to do that better than we ever could, is incredible. It's incredibly challenging. And again, the layers beyond that, I had, I don't know, a unique opportunity. Maybe somebody went crazy or messed up a name on a spreadsheet. But when I was selected to go to IDE, School for Majors, they decided to they actually sent my husband and I. We put down schools in DC because we said, hey, joint spouse, that gives us odds of same place, whatever happens, maybe we'll be living in the same house. And they sent us both to the National Intelligence University, which a maintainer or logistician in the Intel world is a square peg in a round hole if there ever was one. But being able to dive into that world and understand the challenges of supply chain resilience, risk management, and what that means in a contested logistics environment, and what those threats are, where the vulnerabilities are, and also how disconnected the folks in the field, like I was, sometimes are from why we can't just, roll through and do things the way we want to. The environment is much more complex than that. And sourcing, whether it's sourcing parts or what those supply chains themselves look like for a particular end item, or just how you're going to move things and maneuver in a contested environment, that is something that is, the linchpin to any engagement and to the United States strategic advantage. And I truly believe that. And our Air Force has started to realize that as well, and are doing really incredible things to integrate those efforts that, when I was younger in my career, we weren't there. And it's really neat seeing us taking that and really helping people understand their role in managing that supply chain, but also in protecting it.
Hey, you brought up something that I have always confused. Talk to us really quick, okay? And again, I'm a tanker guy. I'm a knuckle dragon tanker guy, okay? But
remember, I'm a tanker guy too, a little bit.
I know, I know.
Yeah.
But and I was
Yeah.
at Kadena,
Yeah.
okay, and I'll never forget the first time I'm watching all these people scurry around an F-15 loading it up, okay,
Yeah.
and I made the mistake of saying, "Oh, the ammo guys are loading airplanes."
Oh, did you
Yeah,
mix them up?
I did. I did
That's
big
bad.
time.
That's
Okay.
bad you
I
do.
did big time. Okay. And one of the guys, wanted to come and like punch me in the nose and to grab me by the throat. So please explain the difference
Yes.
between ammo troops and weapons load troops.
One of the most epic rivalries in the Air Force, ammo
Oh,
versus weapons.
absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
and one of the most epic partnerships. But so your ammo troops, your bomb, if you're hearing about your bomb dump, the bomb builders, they're the ones, they are building, assembling, delivering those munitions. And when you talk about the stockpile and the people being able to do these, they do these incredible exercises where they see how fast and how effectively and efficiently they can build up that stockpile for whatever's coming. They do incredible work that I think is often overlooked because it doesn't happen on the flight line. They bring the trailer, they drop off the trailer, and everything from that point forward is your weapons community. And they are, they work in teams. You have your 1, your 2, your 3 man driving the jammer. They communicate and integrate with each other, which with such precision. They live by those checklists, and they're the ones that if you ever went to a weapons load competition and you saw the teams of 3, if you ever get a chance to go, it's worth going. They race and they do these really cool competitions to just show their pride in what they do and to be certified and be evaluated, because they have to move fast, they have to move with precision, and everything they do has a risk of death and has a risk of failure that's pretty significant. And both communities play a very critical role, and both are very sensitive to being mistaken for each other. I will say that.
Yeah. And Sluggo made that mistake and was corrected immediately by one of the weapons load troops.
I can imagine.
Because, well, they were doing an integrated combat turn. So all of the slammers and the sidewinders and the bullets had already showed up. And, I didn't know what it was. But what they were doing was they were practicing for William Tell, because as you know, ICT, integrated combat turn, is a category that they compete in. And like you said, it's a very, very tight competition to do that.
It is. And you won't see your ammo troops because they show up in the dark of night before the sunrise hits, and they keep everyone out of their compound for good reason. So if you get a chance to slide, I have a lot of love for my ammo community, because again, they are often neglected and they are isolated from the rest of the complex in a lot of ways. And I got to do a couple of trips where I was, they were within my team, and we had our ammo troops and spent a lot of time in the bomb dump and, helping them, but really them helping me understand the breadth of what they did. And it's incredible. And they're a really cool culture and community. Again, you don't see them because they work in the dark of night and keep themselves behind the gates of the ammo dump. But it's a great community that I was really lucky to be a part of for the periods of time where I was.
Yeah, explain to everybody what an ammo dump is, because this is
It's
really
where they
fascinating.
store all the
This
bombs,
is really
all the
fascinating.
bullets, all the explosives are stored and managed within a bomb dump by, again, our ammo troops and the folks that manage that business. And it is, again, it's kind of its own little bubble, usually a little ways off from everything else for good reason. And there's a specific community and career field that are responsible for that.
Strike, I got to go out to Kadina's weapons storage facility. Okay. What an education for a tanker guy. You know, we had $2 billion worth of weapons because when Clark closed, they brought all the PACAF weapons at Clark up
Oh,
to
wow.
Kadena and stuffed them all in there. Okay. And I'm looking at all the different boxes. I'm like going, okay, well, that's a really long box and that's kind of a short box. And they go, oh yeah, that's a harm right there, and that's a Maverick right there, and these Mavericks are we're opening the coffins because we have to do a 2-year inspection on them. I'm like going, what? And he goes, oh yeah. He says, we even inspect the bullets. The bullets have like a time, and that was all stuff that was new to me. And when I went through the bomb dump, okay, I was just, the really crazy thing was the briefing that I got before I could go in saying, okay, if we have a detonation, here's how you get out of the building. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
Oh, yeah.
The safety issue of dealing with the weapons is just incredible. And for a tanker guy like me that had been
Mhm.
around at Strategic Air Command, I mean, we had nukes, it was a little different. But seeing all the different, we had, I think they said, uh 1.5 million rounds of 20 millimeter in boxes in there. I mean, it's crazy when you say like a bomb dump at Mountain Home, it's got a lot of different kinds of weapons in it because of the nature of the airplane, don't you?
Do. And when you think about, I mean, you mentioned there are those communities in the military that are, driven by checklist inspection cycles, and it never stops. And especially when you have multiple squadrons, one is always deploying, and they are also supporting, your defenders and anybody that deals with any sort of munition or explosive. They are dealing in some way with those other teams, which means their mission doesn't do what aviation communities think of, where we're going, we're deploying, and we're recovering. It's at that surge, level and mindset all the time. And so that's another piece of it that I have great respect for, how they maintain what they do with such precision at that level, 365 days a year.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does your husband do, if you don't mind me asking?
He is a pilot. So I didn't, I'm a maintainer married to one. We don't say it out loud very often because, we don't bring it home. We try not to, but we were actually, ironically, when we came back to Mountain Home the second time, the first time he was a T-Bolt, I was a Tiger and was in AMXS. And then we came back and I was in the 389th T-Bolts. He became the commander of the 391st Tigers while I was in the maintenance squadron. So it's been a pretty cool journey. It's also why I've been able to spend so much time in one platform, because maintainers often, as officers, bounce around a bit. I was tied via joint spouse, so I had the privilege of getting to know one airframe pretty well throughout my career.
So you end up at Mildenhall in the 135 community while he's at Lakenheath then in
I
the
did. I
F-15
did.
community.
Yes.
So you have a very fascinating story about being at Mildenhall during Operation Odyssey Dawn. Talk to us about that and being deployed down to Istris. Mildenhall is
Yeah.
a beautiful place. I love that whole area. And I actually took my wife and my 16-year-old son. We actually stayed in the Bird in Hand
Oh,
when we
yes.
were there. Unfortunately, it's closed now. But that's been a
Mhm.
famous place for a long time. But
Yeah.
talk about um, being in a combat environment, a
Yeah.
combat support environment with 135s, and also having your husband flying missions at the same time.
So I'll get to that piece because he ended up not able to be a part of that. He was at the fighter weapons school when all of that went down. One
Oh,
of his greatest regrets is the timing of missing out on that. But it was his assignment to Lakenheath is what brought me to Mildenhall. And honestly, I went to RAF Mildenhall kicking and screaming because I were leaving Seymour Johnson at the time, so it was earlier in our career.
mhm.
But I had been in two fighter squadrons. I was a fighter maintainer, and I had all the stigmas associated with going to tankers or the MAF because people had fed them to me, and they had said tankers are slow and it's not tactical and it's going to be boring and you're not going to know what to do with yourself. But my experience, as you and I have chatted about a bit, destroyed those assumptions. And it was one of the most incredible assignments of my career. Initially, it was a bit of a slower pace, but I found in that slower pace, before everything kicked off in Libya, we were able to take teams and dive into innovation and do things. That's where I got certifications, a Lean Six Sigma black belt, and all these things, because there was some space for it. And some of those slower paced units are able to innovate and do some really cool things with that extra bandwidth. And I ended up in the earlier parts of that career, I ended up with all the safety hats on because our teammates at RAF Lakenheath heard there was a Strike Eagle maintainer over at Mildenhall, and I became the go-to safety investigator. Early in that career, I was, I think, the youngest person ever qualified as a safety investigation board president because a mishap happened over the holidays and they couldn't find anybody who wasn't on leave.
Fascinating.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I led a 6-month investigation that took us back to the depot in the States. It was reported out to the chief of staff. It was this crazy experience. I mean, that's a role reserved for a colonel, an 06 colonel, and I was a captain. And they sent me, the 3 and 4 star sent me on this roadshow briefing all around the Materiel Command and within all of these organizations. And I'll never forget sitting there trying to keep my bearing. At one point, one of these generals came across the table at me screaming and cursing because he didn't like and want to admit what was happening in his unit. And I had the support of the 3 and the 4 star. So you sit there and you do it. But those are those crazy experiences that go beyond, you know, the core of it. And that was all of these crazy things where the first half of my assignment took me way beyond my comfort zone. I was learning from those experiences. And then Libya hits. And I mean, I get chills just thinking about it, because that flip and that transition and what happened in that community, not just, I mean, across USAFE, across UCOM, but at Mildenhall, a tanker base, was one of the craziest experiences of my career. And it kicked off, and we were basically deployed in place for 30 days. The first 30 days was kind of a deployed in place. Forces were amassing all over Europe and moving and maneuvering to try to be strategic for the theater. And as I mentioned, my husband was at fighter weapons school going, I'm missing the thing, you know, it's happening and I'm here. So he was at weapons school for the duration of all of that. I was me and my dog hanging out, you know, living in England. And I'll never forget when it all kicked off. I met a friend of mine at the post office parking lot on Mildenhall. And I wasn't allowed to tell anyone but my spouse anything. So I said, hey, today you're my spouse, and here's the keys to my house. My dog is in the house. I am leaving. I can't tell you where I'm going, and I don't know when I'm coming back. And it was one of those, I've got to be back at work in 10 minutes. Thank you to a friend. We were lucky to have somebody that we could do that with.
And the dog likes Purina, you know.
He knew my dog.
And off you go, and off you go.
Dog, at least. But it was like, yeah, I don't even know. And I didn't get to say goodbye to the dog. I got my bag. I was leaving, and I didn't know when I was coming back. Instead of leaving, and they never knew that, as far as they were concerned and she was concerned, I was gone. We spent 30 days on a short enough hook that I was living in my office. I was taking naps with my face on my desk. Eventually, my sweet British secretary, her name was Wendy, went and scrounged a couch from someone leader that lived on base and took naps at their own house. And she would close the door and just tell people I wasn't there so I could sleep for more than 5 minutes. And we were working at a pace for 24/7 for that first month that was unimaginable. And what we realized early on, and some of what drove that, is that, you know, the CAOC and those managing theater operations didn't know how to manage tankers in a contested scenario. And they would send out, in the early days, we would get these ATOs telling us, you know, for those who aren't familiar, here's what you're going to fly, here's the windows we're going to fly you in, or here's what we need to see as far as the ripple of tankers in theater. And in some cases, they were doomed to failure quickly, you know, and you want to be able to sustain an operation. And so we were pulling overnighters, writing new TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures for tanker ops, because nobody had ever done it like this before. And we were building out tankers like you build a fighter vol, so like a vulnerability window, and blocking it out and figuring out how to sustain an operation in ways we had never really flown a tanker fleet. And I was so lucky to have that fighter experience, because as we were navigating the situation and having those conversations, I understood the context of what they were trying to do, when others in the tanker world were going, they can't, and they just need to do their piece differently. And it doesn't work that way. And so It doesn't. And it was, the integration of that. I had a lead pro super who manages, senior master sergeant who manages the maintenance operations. He had special ops experience with tankers. So he knew how to do it differently. And through those 30 days, I'd be pulling all-nighters with our analyst and we're writing TTP for the day-to-day. My lead super was trying to figure out how we were going to be an expeditionary tanker unit, because every day we thought we were leaving within a few hours, and we thought we were taking our business and plopping somewhere and we didn't know where. There were some scenarios where we were going to take off and we wouldn't know where we were landing till we landed. And leadership would say, we can't. And he would be the one saying, we can't say can't. We'll sleep on the plane. we'll bring whatever we bring on the plane and we can survive for a week. As long as we have our tanker, we will be fine. And it was such an unknown environment and so uncomfortable that just being able to manage the discomfort and being so far beyond our comfort zones and get okay with that and help our leaders see that we would be able to thrive and adapt on our own. And we didn't know when we were leaving until it hit. And when those deployment orders hit, we were going to Istres, the English pronunciation in the south of France. It's, the Air Force Base 125, Base Aérienne 125. And I was in a meeting with wing leadership. They were telling us where we were going. And they had been fighting with the embassy, who didn't want to send an interpreter. They said they didn't want to fund it, didn't think it was necessary. My boss stood up and he said, I don't need one. We don't need one for this trip because Captain Stevens is fluent in French and she can interpret and run maintenance. So everything's fine. Hadn't talked to me about this. And I did have an interpreter certification, but I hadn't used it since I was deployed with the French to Bagram, Afghanistan with the rockets in 2007. And I was actually helping them negotiate bomb dump contracts and agreements with the bomb dump. And that was a long time ago. And less than 24 hours from that meeting, we were boots on the ground, and I was the only French linguist on site with our package of tankers. And the next several months, I did everything from negotiating contracts with our contracting reps for everything from portable toilets to fuel additives, or mediating conversations with our commander and the French delegation that was on site, and then pulling all-nighters in maintenance. And I remember I had an expediter who would pull up his truck and he would put me in the passenger seat and he'd roll the window up and he was like, force me to take a nap as the planes were flying. He'd go, the takeoffs are done. You've got 20 minutes till anything lands. And I would just be napping on the side of an expediter window as we did our laps around the flight line. And, I look back on that moment. The embassy told all of our leaders at Mildenhall, you don't need an interpreter because all French officers are fluent in French, or fluent in English, excuse me. And I'll never forget.
No, they're not.
They're not. So
I've worked in the Vicenza Chaos strike. I know they're not.
They are not. And it's just crazy because you think of this scenario and you go, okay, we're going to be working on launching aircraft, recovering aircraft, fighting the fight. The most impactful phone call I got in that capacity as an interpreter, it was 2 a.m. and I got called to the military hospital. And I walked in and there was, a bed with one of my troops laying in the bed. There was a surgeon and there were 5 nurses lined up in a row who collectively spoke about 50 words in English, but they were the ones who spoke some English. And they were ready to cut into one of my troops and perform open surgery. And 15 minutes of triage between the patient, me, and the surgeon, and he had indigestion and they sent him away with an antacid. But these were the situations we were putting units in, and we weren't the only ones, where you're plopped into a place where people say it's a first world country. You're deployed to the south of France, which is a beautiful place to be, but the circumstances and what we were doing and the pace at which we were having to do it, and those disconnects, being in a foreign country, regardless of third world, first world, were significant and put us all. I mean, you want to talk about unusual circumstances the Air Force never trained you for. That one probably takes the cake for me.
Yeah. And see, people don't understand about the contracting piece.
Gosh.
And I didn't either. And I worked in the Vicenza Kayak and then was the chief of the air fuel and control team for Afghanistan and Iraq. And I'd go to contracting folks and go, oh, well, today, it's this and today it's that. And it was always something different. And you had to, not only did you have to negotiate those contracts, you had to find out who had the stuff that you needed.
Absolutely.
And then do the contracts. And then sometimes the contracts were done wrong, and that added another layer of, shall we say, conversations, you know.
Absolutely. I couldn't believe what I had dealt with contracting on a broader scale, doing things for fleets and contract modifications and these bigger contracts. And when we ended up down there for Libya, the contingency contracting and what happens in a contingency environment was mind-boggling to me. So we had a master sergeant with signatory authority for contracts, and then we had a finance member who was, I think, maybe a staff or a tech sergeant, small female wearing a fanny pack full of cash. And together,
Yeah.
they just made it happen. Okay, we have nowhere we're allowed to buy food or ways to bring food to us. We have, again, fuel additives. Our fuel is not going to work, and we've got to start launching airplanes. How do we get the right fuel additives? Because we're about to run out of our stash. And just all these crazy things that they're just running around negotiating and navigating an environment with no oversight or guidance. And they were incredible. It was absolutely incredible to see them work together and the training they had received to be able to do what they did in that environment. Mind-blowing to me. And we would not have been successful in that environment without them being able to think on their feet and be agile. Again, facing just all these, agreements to use the hospital was a huge piece of it, to even be able to use medical services. And the number of things that required them, they were pulling all-nighters too, to make us safe and supported in the environment so we could do our jobs.
And you know what, Strike, you mentioned gas, and people don't understand when you go to different countries, there's different kinds of gas.
Yes.
All right. And
can't just pull up to the pump.
No, you can't. Okay.
No.
And particularly the additive piece, Constantine, was it somewhere in Bulgaria where we put KC-10s? We had to go back and look at, okay, a fuels guy actually or gal had to go there as part of the Advon team to find out what kind of gas do they have. Because if you put the wrong kind of gas in a tanker, you pollute everybody. And I mean everybody.
You do.
And so when you talk about contracting for the gas and the right additives, I learned that the hard way when I was running tankers in the Middle
We
East.
almost did as well. I remember that. I've actually got a picture of on one of our offsites with the tech sergeant who was our fuels guy on Advon. And I remember we had to put him on the phone with some teams he was talking to people way above his pay grade because they were saying, nope, we already checked. We're sending you there because they have the right kind of gas, and just explaining the fizzy additive and the impact of that and why it was so critical. And then again, getting the contracting capability down there to do what we needed to do. And then trying to translate that in French and trying to get the French to understand what we needed was almost our downfall, because the folks who decided and wrote, international agreements for us to go there aren't including the right people in those conversations. So I think just the criticality of that integrating all those support functions as early as possible is a lesson I learned a lot earlier, but I think a lot of people learned it the hard way during those operations in Libya, because you had them making fast decisions and they weren't cross-checking themselves for those support functions that were going to be absolutely critical once you started flying jets and getting airplanes in theater.
Well, and you know what, Strike, people don't understand, and they can't fathom the amount of gas a deployed tanker unit is using. Okay.
Yeah.
And when we were looking at more places to operate from during Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, that was the first criteria that we had to look at. And that was the one criteria that pretty much said, okay, we can't go here, we can't go here, we can't go here. You can either go to an international airport or a prepared military airfield, and that's it.
Oh, yeah. And it was that offset of looking at how much gas you're having to burn to get to theater from your home of base, because people said, you're in Europe already. They're right there. They just fly from there. But the duration of sortie was one thing, and most people got that. But weighing the amount of gas you were using and expending to get to the theater versus getting closer to the fight and being able to support all of those aspects was, again, that 30 days sounds like we were just doing the thing and they moved us, but it was a very complex time for the folks that were managing this as a theater and across Operation Odyssey Dawn during the early days. It was an incredibly complex feat, and they were juggling pieces on a board to try to find the best case solution in in an engagement that was changing every day. So I applaud the folks that were trying to navigate that because it was incredibly complex. And again, people see Europe as simple. It's almost more complex because it isn't a place they're just going to let us plop and set up a bunch of tents. And you're having to integrate with bases that don't necessarily want other forces there, don't have the resources for it. And you're in, urban environments where they don't have the space, the fuel, whatever it is. It was a very complex international negotiation for the folks that were planning this on a broader scale.
It sounds like, as you're talking about this was probably one of those parts of your career, one of those events in your career where you really learned a lot.
Yeah.
Over a period of time. Okay. If you had to say, okay, from this deployment, what are the 2 lessons learned I learned from this? What would you say they are?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 big lessons. The first one we've talked about a lot already. It's that integration of functions. It's those things that I continue to learn through my, efforts in Fighters and at Mountain Home, but how you have to integrate and be able to think on your feet as a team and navigate those complex situations. I think the biggest lesson I learned personally through all of that as a leader had less to do with the broad tactical, what we were doing, and more the level of overwhelm and overload that was placed on any leader in that situation when Odyssey Dawn hit. It wasn't what we were preparing for. It wasn't what any of us had trained to. And personally, with as many hats as I ended up with, I had to learn how to take down my guard and let my team support me. And if I had put on a front as a leader and pretended everything's okay and I can just do all these things, I would have burnt out so fast, I would have been useless to them. And I had to be vulnerable to my team and tell them what I was struggling with and working with. I had to let them bring me food and force me to eat and sleep and all those things. But I also, when I was being pulled away, I had to learn how to trust them to handle the mission and to clearly communicate their needs to me because nothing in the mission stopped for a second. And on the flip side, I think another thing, and it kind of goes along with that, but it was on a broader scale, is we learned in a really cool way that we needed to trust and lean on our international partners, and also that we were there representing as ambassadors to the US. And I'll tell a story, and it's not what we pictured when we went down there. We were invited early on. We were invited to attend. It was a celebratory event, an anniversary to do with World War II in a local town. And we were invited, which I put in air quotes. We were basically told by the embassy, you will go represent the United States, take some people away. And it was chaos. We didn't have time. We didn't have people, but we were going to do the thing. We were told it was happening. And so reluctantly, we grab a handful of people, 5 or 6 of us, get in a car, and we drive to this tiny town. I think I promised to buy them all lunch and said, don't worry, guys, we'll go to the thing and then it'll be fine. We'll get back to work. And we show up weaving down this tiny country road and we park. Somebody waves us down and we come around the corner and it's just a big field. And we had driven to this big field and there were a few little bleachers set up. Meet all these people. No one speaks English. So I am just kind of translating, meeting, shaking hands. And what we watched unfold, we found out was happening every weekend in every village across France, was a celebration of freedom to honor the United States and the role that the United States had played in the freedom of France and of these people's grandparents and great grandparents. They had American Jeeps. They had American World War II uniforms. They had this beautiful ceremony parade and acted these things out and gave these compelling speeches. And every single bit of it was to honor the United States. And what they told me afterwards, there had not been an American at their ceremony in a decade. And yet they're waving American flags and they are just overwhelmed with emotion and gratitude in this little town. We continued to get invited to those, and we've suddenly brought some young guys to this, and this little group of us went, we can't say no to these. Oh my God, because people were crying and they were thanking us and they were hugging them, and we continued to go to these. And I often share a story. This was at a later event. I had an opportunity to go to an air show, so I was with some air crew near Paris. And this was after I had come back from Istris and from all of those operations. And my husband, it was a 2-ship of Strike Eagles. And we were at this air show in Cambrai outside of Paris, and all French, not a big American population, but these French people were obsessed with these jets coming out to their air show. And I was playing interpreter. Wasn't my role, but people just started talking. There was this man that came up to us, and he looked like he had just come out of a biker bar, probably 70 years old, big, gruff man. And he walked up to me and he kind of grabbed me and he said, are you the one that speaks French? And he goes, I need you to tell them, talking about the air crew, what I'm going to tell you. And he's got tears in his eyes, and he rolls up both of his sleeves, and he has tattoos on both forearms that are these murals that are tributes to the United States, contributing to the freedom of the French people. And there was, a D-Day, Normandy, and it was American flags on his arms. And this guy is just weeping, telling me,
and your heart's pounding in your chest while you're sitting there listening to this guy.
Well, and the poor air crew are sitting there. They have no idea what he's saying. All they see is this man. He has both of his forearms. He's holding both of my hands with a death grip. And he's just crying as he tells me what it means to him, and that he would not, he said, I would not be free if it weren't for them. And we continue to be free because of them. And I want them to know how much this means. And those sentiments were expressed to us down in Istris. My first experience were those villages in Istris. And that was kind of a year later to have that experience, realizing what role Americans have played in cultures and communities like this. It reframed, for me and every airman, I think we got everybody on that package out to one of those, as we kept getting invited. Every village celebrated, here's the day that this American fell in a parachute into our field and we saved him. And then a year later, the same American came back with his troops and freed us. That was the story from that field. Is they said my grandmother saw him, kept him safe in her garage, and then a year later he came back, and that's why we're free. And you go, the world is such a bigger place, and these relationships that we see politics play out and all these things, the human beings at the center of it, and feeling what they felt and realizing. I think for all of us it was humbling to see the gratitude that they continue to celebrate every year after year for their freedom and for what they have, and for the people that helped contribute to that, was life-changing, I think, for all of us, and just reframed, not only our relationship with France and what exists outside of, Paris and politics, but just how to appreciate what you have and continue to celebrate that, so that you're not just living in the next crisis. I think that was, I still talk to and am in touch with a lot of people from that trip and from that deployment. And it's something we still talk about and remember. I have a little flag. Here's my that one of them gave us at that first one. They gave us all these little flags, and just, hands shaking, sharing the meaning of us, just because they said, we've never seen an American here. And for you to be here in person to say thank you was incredible.
And think about the impression that made on your young troops.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Your airmen and stuff like that. They're like going, wait a minute, this guy's hugging me. Mm-hmm. They will never forget that.
No. And it changed all of us and how we view what we do, especially when we're overseas, wherever we are. And we've all had those experiences, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq, or, we think of those experiences, but being with, an ally and a partner nation who carried that story down through generations. And to them, it is still, it's so fresh and so new to them, because they share those stories and they celebrate them in ways that we don't always celebrate our own, impact in the world and our own freedom, and just what America means to us. It was a very special experience being able to connect with those communities.
Oh, yeah. And we took my youngest son out of school for 80 days and we homeschooled him in Europe, and we took him to Normandy. And another emotional experience for me.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the carillon bells.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I'm panning with my phone as they're playing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in front of 9,000 some odd crosses and Jewish stars and everything like that. And I happen to pan by my wife, and she's just, we're just trying to hold it back. And we don't appreciate the greatest generation. And unfortunately, so many of them are gone now. And they just said, hey, it was my job to do this, to parachute into, easy company and the whole band of brothers saying, watching them do all that. And, you got to see it up close and personal with these people coming up to you, I mean, I can't imagine this biker guy coming up and going, "Hey, look at these."
Oh,
And
I could barely see him through my own, my eyeballs were leaking. But it's,
So
yeah.
when you were telling the air crew, "Hey, this is what he's saying," what was their emotions?
Oh,
What were
I
they
mean,
thinking?
I think, again, you rarely get the chance to hear that gratitude. Most of them had deployed Iraq, Afghanistan, or surrounding areas supporting places like Iraq and Afghanistan at this point, because this was, by then it was probably 2011, 2012 timeframe. And so that's what they knew. That's what they had done. And it never comes as close to home, and you never get to go back on the ground and hear from and talk to those people unless you end up in an advisor role. And it was same thing. It was incredible for them. And they, we had been doing the air show thing, and it completely changed how they viewed their role and why they were there. And it really was life-changing. And many of them came back and made trips and took, we were stationed in England at the time, so it's easy to take trips back and really, the meaning of going, like for us, we planned an extensive trip to Normandy, and we planned to go back and visit some of those places because we realized, we didn't know our own history as well as they knew our history. And so to see that and be humbled by it and go, wow, there's more for me to learn to appreciate what actually happened here, with our own people, with the people that we were helping and fighting with. Again, life-changing, I think, when you're connected that closely to somebody who helps you realize maybe the things that we take for granted.
So,
yeah.
How long did you guys stay at Istris? How long were you?
So I was probably there total, it was less than a year, I think, that the tankers were in Istris, and we would rotate people through because that was the simplicity of once we got settled there. We were there several months with that first contingent, just getting bedded down, getting settled. It was kind of a typical deployment timeline for most people. And then once we got settled and going, we realized we were going to be there for a little bit longer. And I was actually in a position, I was an exec to the wing commander when we pulled out, and got to fly down with him and meet and see some of those folks because I had left and I had changed jobs, and got to go back down for the last trip to thank the leadership there and to, help show our gratitude because we were leaving, we were pulling back away, and it was a short-term relationship with them specifically. It was really cool to be able to close that chapter. With a boss of mine that's one of the best people I've ever worked for. I get to work with him still, and show him and show some of the leadership on the base who weren't down there as this just tumultuous time unfolded and we figured this all out, to really realize that we couldn't have done what we did without that partnership, which was hard at times, and to help them realize that we needed to show our appreciation for what they had allowed us to do there.
Hey, I want you to talk about something I read, the Psychological Safety Working Group. I had never heard of such a thing, Strike. Can you explain to my listeners?
Yes.
Explain what that is and the kind of work you're doing in this safety group.
Yeah. So a part of that story that I don't know if I've shared very often, if at all, I didn't know what that term meant either. So what you saw in my LinkedIn or bio is that I co-chaired a working group on psychological safety for Air Combat Command when General Mobile Holmes was the ACC commander for the Air Force. And it was under the ACC Sword Athena construct, focused on, there were efforts focused on mental health, psychological safety, and I was in command at the time. We were working on a lot of efforts for peer-to-peer programs, suicide prevention. I've been very involved in some of those efforts after sharing some of my own struggles and what I've been through. And our teams were working on some cool stuff, and they sent down a task to say, hey, we want some people to be a part of these working groups. And I called the number at the bottom of the thing, and I said, I think I sent a message and said, I'd like to know more. I think we might have people. And my first question was, I don't know what psychological safety is. So can you help me with what you're doing with this? And what we found out was what we were trying to create and the environment we were trying to create with peer support and with culture of trust and being able to challenge each other in, a healthy working environment and get help when you needed help, but really just be, some of the things I learned in all of the stories we've talked about previously is if you don't let your guard down and share what you're struggling with and share the vulnerabilities and the blind spots with your team, you're weaker because of it. And if you come together and can look at that all clearly and be willing to speak up and say, hey, here's a problem I don't know how to solve, et cetera. That's some of the stuff we were working on, and we didn't have the term for it. And the term comes from Amy Edmondson, who's a researcher who wrote a bunch on it. And a lot of her research was in a medical field, and it was looking at case studies where, because people were, maybe not all the way toxic environment, but they were in an environment where they felt afraid or hesitation to speak up when they saw something wrong. It's not just about personal struggles. It's usually in those cases where you see a problem or you see something going badly, which again, in the medical field has dire consequences, and you're afraid to speak up because of whatever climate or culture has been established, and a lack of, it's not trust, because the way that Amy Edmondson explains it is trust is interpersonal relationships, human to human. Psychological safety has to do with the general climate and the environment that you're in. And that's what General Holmes was trying to do, was to figure out how to get after that culture, that war fighting culture where, you can trust the person to your left, the person to your right, to check your blind spots, and to be there if you have a weak spot or need to step back, they step forward, and you're communicating that clearly. And again, I didn't know the term for it, but we were all kind of doing this from different angles. And we got to work with some pretty great people, both academic and, operators from different environments, just talking about the challenges in different cultures. We had folks from Intel, with highly classified environments where they are afraid to showcase and share vulnerabilities or issues they see because of fear for security clearances or, whatever other things they're dealing with. Again, whether it's personal and people struggling and you're looking at it from a suicide prevention lens, or tactically, we found that something our aviators, as you know, are great at is you're going to call each other out. You're going to point out all the things. We're going to debrief it. And that debrief culture is and should be a culture of psychological safety. And many other communities in the Air Force in particular didn't have that and didn't know how to embody that and felt, like that's conflict. And it's like, you don't all have to agree, it still could be confrontational, but it's healthy confrontation and it allows you to see a broader perspective. And it was a really cool experience, especially for somebody like General Holmes, to help look at that from a command perspective and then figure out what we could do to support commanders in building those cultures and removing barriers to really being the war fighters that they needed to be in all of those functions.
And at a personal level in the military, I came in the 80s. And if you had something that was bugging you, you hid it, you stuffed it down.
Oh, yeah.
You compartmentalize it, okay? And compartmentalize it, particularly in Strategic Air Command, because you couldn't say anything if you had one of those nuclear clearances.
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
That's one thing that I'm really glad that the Air Force has embraced, is now being able to, hey, what are you dealing with?
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had a commander that says, Sluggo, are you okay? What's going on at home?
Yeah.
And I said, well, sir, I just got off the phone with my wife. I was deployed to the KAOC, and I've got 2 kids with pneumonia, and she can't get an appointment with a flight surgeon. And the colonel says, I'll take care of that right now. And he went and called my wing commander, who called my squadron commander, who called me and goes, what's going on?
Yeah.
And he got kind of blindsided. I said, Tim, I'm sorry, but here's what's going on. And you can't function when you've got 2 baby kids at home that have pneumonia.
No, I think it does take on, it's very personal to me. It's very personal to so many people because there is a huge overlap with, mental health stigmas and what that culture allows you to share. And we both grew up in times that you didn't say the things, you didn't share your problems. And I think culturally, we all grew up feeling like if I just ignore the thing and get through it, it's gone, like nothing happened. And I personally, I've shared some of my own story. After I had my son, I struggled with mental illness. I experienced suicidal ideation for about a year after having my son. It wasn't all postpartum, although that's what I initially chalked it up to. I was on a panel talking with someone about it who kind of challenged my own beliefs. And she used a computer analogy, which I think really ties into that psychological safety and how these burdens stack. And she said, you know, you need to think of your mind like a computer. And I'm a maintainer. We abuse our computers. We're good with our machines the other way, but not the computers. And she said, you know, everything that happens in life, you're open in tabs. You know, I had traumatic physical injury early in my career. There's 10 tabs because I'm still dealing with it. You know, the kids are sick. You have a kid, it opens 20 tabs because it's a lot. And if you don't properly file those away, and if you don't actually purposely do something with them, whether it's a trauma or just a thing that's going on that you're pretending isn't bothering you, those stack up and the computer eventually crashes. And that was definitely true in my case. And if you're in an environment where you can't speak up and just say, you know, here's a problem I'm dealing with. Maybe it's at home, maybe it's personal, maybe it's work, and maybe we can't even do anything about it. But at least acknowledging it, I'm not putting on a mask and just pretending and carrying the burden of just faking it. It's out there and people can go, hey, you doing all right today? Yep, crushing it. And you can still be that version of yourself that isn't, you know, just piling those things up in the background and eventually crashing, because that's burnout at its worst. And it was happening to so many people. And that's, I think, when General Holmes kicked off that working group, when ACC and the Air Force really started looking at that stuff seriously, because they were seeing burnout, especially in their leaders. Because I knew, gosh, after I shared my story, I had so many instances where people would come up to me and they would share, as leaders, as chiefs, as colonels, as generals, you know, I'm struggling, but I can't get help myself until I'm not in uniform anymore, because then I'm not going to be able to lead my people the way they need me to. And they felt they could not until they took the uniform off. And people who shared tougher stories where they took the uniform off and they hadn't gotten help through all that, and they struggled hard and barely survived it and wished they had approached it differently or felt like they could have. So I think it's, you know, it's a critical readiness element, because we're burning people out faster than we can make new people and bring them up behind, you know?
See, my PTSD moment didn't come until after I got out of the military.
Yeah.
You know? And it was compounded by a major health emergency. Our 16-year-old son was diagnosed with cancer and battled for 14 months and didn't make it.
Yeah.
And
so sorry.
fortunately for us, we had an Army psychologist that had his own practice. And, you know, how do you get through something like that, man?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, especially if you're piling it on top of all these little things and you go,
Exactly.
I think I had somebody talking about suicide, and it was, you know, somebody's lost hope and it's hopelessness. And all you ever see is that last chapter. And you never really know what piled up in those layers up to that point. And it might not have been the divorce or the breakup or the finances or whatever little thing, you know, you could tag it to. But if you knew how many things were piled up, mentally, physical injury, all the thing, medical, so many things pile up. What that does to somebody, if you're not actively managing your health, mental and physical, it compounds, no matter how good of a compartmentalizer you are and how good your poker face is. And I think the stellar poker face that we all learn to develop in the military is a downfall in that case, you know, because you put it on and you get stronger with it, and people are less likely to check in because we're pretty good at faking it.
Oh, real good at faking it.
You know? Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm fine. I'm
I'm great.
I'm fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but at night you're rolling over in bed and you're a little bawling your eyes out, you know?
Oh yeah.
So
we've come a long way. I think those conversations, there's still a long way to go, but people are willing to talk about it. They're normalizing those conversations, and they're trying to figure out different ways to approach it so that, you know, service isn't putting so much on top of just life that people can't actually thrive while they're going through their careers, that they're barely surviving. And I think, you know, the culture's shifting. It's going to take a while, but it's good to see it moving in the right direction.
It's moving in the right direction. So,
yeah.
Hey, while you're at the Pentagon, tell everybody what a Corona conference is, because this is really a fascinating thing that happens. And you were involved in Corona conferences where you have all of these leaders come together and talk a little bit about what they discuss and what goes on at a Corona conference.
Yeah. So my last job, I was working as a chief of integration for the chief of staff, for the secretary. And our team really had the role of bringing those conferences together and helping figure out what would be meaningful. And it's like any large organization where on some frequency, you're bringing together your board of directors, you're bringing together your leadership team. And there's only so much you can do these days. People manage by email, and sometimes you have to come together and hash it out and make meaningful decisions, or seek to understand some of these bigger problems we're dealing with. And so the Corona conference originated. There are stories about Corona cigars and way back in the day that started and kicked off the Corona. You can Google that and see some cool history of it. But really, it is that meeting of minds and senior leaders across now the Department of the Air Force, because you have Air and Space Force. Some of them are Air Force, and then they alternate combined and working integrated with the Space Force. And they are, you hope, coming together to make meaningful decisions to further the strategic objectives of the Air Force. There's 2 a year. The Warfighting Conference, which is Air Force only, happens kind of in the spring, summer, and alternates locations between Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and MacDill. And they're doing, there was a huge contested logistics tabletop exercise, and they're really getting into, the future warfighting strategy for the Air Force. And then in the fall, it's at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and it is the broader audience, and they're talking all the issues, decisions as a leadership team to figure out where they're going to go as a department. And an incredible thing to be involved in. You see bureaucracy at its best and at its worst through that lens. And so, I think it's amazing to see the progress, and then you also see the areas where, you wish it was more than a big bureaucracy. But I was really proud to see some of the leaders that were in there fighting to make a difference, both for people and for, technology and future warfighting, and seeing that balance and what that needed to look like for the Air Force and the Space Force.
And things that come out of these Corona conferences sometimes are pretty incredible, where they sometimes shift the focus on some things in the Air Force. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're moving this direction. We're going to take a 5-degree right turn now. And,
the last several, you see the fundamental changes in how the Air Force is going to deploy, shifting from that Afghanistan, Iraq mindset to, AF4Gen and the way we present forces to the Joint Force, because they saw that the old model wasn't working, and trying to turn the wheel and get the rudder turning in a completely different direction for how we approach presenting and deploying forces. That obviously takes a long time and many iterations, and now you see that in implementation. But those types of constructs have been being built and brainstormed and tabletopped for quite a while. So seeing those come to fruition again, all you can hope is that it's tied to the people having to execute, and that everybody's doing their due diligence to bring those things to decision and make sure that we have decisions that can be implemented in the field.
The old deployment model did not help the tankers at all. We got busier.
No, it didn't. That I think was eye-opening for me when I went from fighters to mobility Air Force, and realizing that dynamic of, everybody's got TACC down their throats and whatever other missions. And then we went to USAFE, and we also had the, AMD and the taskings from UCOM, and it was everything all at once. And obviously, I've worked with other mobility forces, but realizing how completely 180 that was from the typical fighter mindset of, okay, you're on your AEF, and here's what that cycle looks like. And I think they're still navigating the complexity of the new construct and how that can even apply across the different functions that we serve in the Air Force, and where it might not work as well as they'd hoped, and adapting as they try it out.
Yep. Hey, last thing I want to go over with you, victory strategies. Talk to us about what you're doing now and what victory strategies is. I went through your roster, the roster for victory strategies, and wow, there's some powerful people working for you.
I am grateful to be on such an incredible team. And I think so many people, transition from active duty is tough. It is a mental transition. It is figuring out your purpose and your place in life. And it was quite a roller coaster for me as I, navigated industry and, talk to all these businesses and companies and see what's out there, and try to figure out how you continue to serve the veteran community, because that's always very close to my heart. And victory strategies kind of fell in my lap right in the moment I needed it. I was doing a lot of consulting and work on my own, but I mentioned I came in the Air Force because I wanted to be on a team, and working as a solo act and on my own, or in certain industries where you feel a bit more isolated, it just wasn't the fit. And they approached me, and I've done some speaking in areas of mental health and resilience. I had not looked at coaching, but I loved developing leaders. And through Victory Strategies, they have kind of a portfolio working with all industries. So it's kind of cool because I also got out because I wanted to learn and grow away from the military institution and learn how things worked in the outside world. And I have been so grateful to be able to have, I'm a coach to clients working in all kinds of different industries, working with teams and helping, their growth, and with a team full of people that we are all sounding boards to each other, from military background, but we've got athletes, we've got folks from, industry and business, whether it's big company or family business. And I've learned so much from teammates that have such different backgrounds to me. And I think for me as a leader, where I've always grown the most is when I am interacting with people who see the world very differently than me. And I don't like being on a team where everybody is in a stovepipe viewing things from that same perspective. And that's really, to me, the most beautiful part of being on this team is growing from their experience and being able to serve our clients and develop leaders, in a wide variety of industries, realizing that leadership in teams and, thriving as a leader, kind of the same everywhere you go. But you can learn from people, again, no matter the context of their leadership. And, I'm still able to stay involved in veteran work and other activities alongside that, to keep fueling that passion. And the work with Victory Strategies just fills me up, because developing leaders is what we've all done for our military careers, and continuing that was a blessing.
I'll never forget Strike, the first time I met a Navy SEAL.
Yeah, we got a few of those.
You talk about a culture and attitude completely different than what my tanker bros and sisters.
Absolutely.
Very, very different.
No, I love it. And that's our CEO is a SEAL, but he's a SEAL sniper that was enlisted. And then you have, one of our teammates is a SEAL who worked and ran the Bud School for a while. He did make us do a lot of push-ups early in the morning at our team offsite. He didn't make us, I won't say that. He voluntarily offered for us to wake up early and do some stuff, which I love that kind of stuff. So I joke, but I absolutely loved it. And what is kind of cool to see the diversity in that community. And, a few of those teammates came out of the SEALs and then worked in just these cool channels in industry that were totally different. And they're like the American dream. They stepped out and created something for themselves and learned and grew in industry and wanted to go and give back and, do incredible work with veteran communities, but also share a leadership perspective that I think is absolutely incredible. And yeah, they're another breed. It's like fighter pilots are a breed, maintainers are a breed, SEALs. I think, like the athletes on our team, it's really cool to hear their perspective on leadership and team building, and how that can apply, when you start to think of things from those different perspectives, it clicks with people in ways that you can't always get when you're, developing each other in the same industry.
I'll never forget, we spent 3 years at the Joint Forces Staff College. And of course, I'm not going to move out there and not live near Oceana Naval Air Station where there's airplanes flying around. But of course, we had Dam Neck there too, And being in an LDS ward, we had a couple of the Navy SEALs there. And wow, that was really an education for me. And the biggest education came, I think, from how they plan in a crisis and execute in a real crisis, and that was just really fascinating to me. And then it's been
cool seeing our teammates. You got fighter pilots, Navy SEALs, the athletes. Some of our team puts together experiential workshops that help companies navigate complex crisis scenarios and how to interact. It really gets down to psychological safety and how to challenge each other and interact in ways that break down barriers, which in industry, sometimes that is just not the way people work and interact, especially when you take hybrid or virtual work into account, and seeing teams come together and learn how to really interact and get through those gritty situations and come together instead of letting it become friction that tears them apart. I think it's really cool to see those constructs and how Victory has approached that experiential leadership training alongside everything else. Just really cool to see industry partners learning through some of those tactics and techniques that our SEAL partners, our athletes, learned through their experience.
When I left the Air Force, I went to work for a major defense industry partner. Okay. And the best way I could describe it was the titanium cylinders of excellence. Okay. And I actually asked my boss one day, why is everybody resisting what I'm trying to do here? We've got a real problem with a customer here, and it's going to take 3 different groups to fix this. And he looked at me and goes, Mark, you're doing something, trying to bring all of these senior directors into a room, and they probably haven't been in a room and talked to each other in 3-5 years. I said, you're kidding me. He goes, no, no, you're doing something that we rarely do.
Yeah. When it makes them uncomfortable, you're taking them beyond their comfort zones if that's not muscle memory for them.
No, and it wasn't. Okay. It wasn't. And we were going to ask some very, very hard questions. And I knew that the meeting was going to be contentious. All right. And it was over stupid radios for the EA6B of all things. All right. And sure enough, man, we got together in that room, and man, it's just like, and I'm just kind of like going, whoa, all right, let's fix the problem. All right, let's talk about the problem. So, thank heavens for a group like Victory Strategies that can take experiences that you've had in leadership in the industry and take it into industry. Because there were several meetings I was in this company where I went, oh my gosh, we need a big cultural change here.
Oh, and it's never malicious. It's like they don't know what it looks like. They don't have a framework for it. And being able to help show them and give them exercises to practice it and put it into practice, but also those frameworks to sustain it and do it themselves instead of just, okay, you went and did this fun thing, you felt it for a second. Now, how the heck do I translate that back? That's where I think the way we approach coaching is really cool as well, being able to coach and work with a leader who's trying to navigate that and play the long game, because that's not something you can snap your fingers and someone now has that skill set to mediate and facilitate that type of culture. Culture shift takes years, decades, not days. And I think that's the cool part of, many of our client partnerships are really for the long game and helping people look back and go, man, we never could have had this meeting and gotten through this tough conversation had we not gone on this journey, because it is a journey and it's not easy to change and shift how you approach leadership.
No. And particularly where you have people that have this one guy, senior director, had done nothing but UHF radios for 20 years in his career and didn't know how that radio would integrate in something like a Strike Eagle.
Oh, right? Wow.
How does this radio actually integrate in a Strike Eagle? What is it used for? AFSAT, all these other different things. He had no idea. No idea. Yeah. Anyway. Hey, Strike, it's been fun to have you on. I got to go. And I just want to tell you, this has been fabulous. And I've really enjoyed the almost 2 hours we've spent together talking about this. And
no, I appreciate you. I appreciate your questions. I appreciate your perspective. And, as someone who, it's always great interacting with somebody who wants to see the world from those different viewpoints and understand how we learn from this chaos we all went through, whether it's military service or otherwise. Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation and the chance to spend some time with you.
Thanks again. And Sluggo signing out here, Strike. Thanks again for being on.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Folks, this is why I do this show. I get to interview great people like Strike. Those were some great stories and great lessons. She was working on probably one of the most sophisticated fighters in the world. So I appreciate Strike coming on and sharing a lot of her time with us. This episode, again, supported by Wall Pilot. Go to Wall Pilot and you can find 158 ready to print 4, 6, and 8 foot beautiful profiles of your favorite aircraft. You can see the KC-135 here above me. Or we can do custom work for you too. I now have access to over 700 profiles. Helicopters are really hard, really tough right now, and we're working on those. Apache, Sea King, and some other ones. So go to wallpilot.com and order a couple of these to help support the show. Join my Patreon, All Ranks Club. Those that join at the designated driver or the by the bar level have one-on-one question and answer periods with me. We have a virtual bar night. We just sit around and talk aviation. And I just received a bunch of really cool 7-inch stickers, as I showed you in the opening, like that you'll be able to buy. Also, if you just want to contribute, I've got my PayPal and my Venmo link below. Send whatever you want. It goes straight to the show. It doesn't go into any bank accounts of mine. It is all to help support the Lessons from the Cockpit show. And I thank all of you that have been doing this, because now we're pretty self-sustained, which is where I wanted to be. Thanks for joining me on the Lessons from the Cockpit show. Having all of you guys and gals join me to talk aviation and to listen to these stories, it means a lot to me. And it means a lot to these people that are getting their stories out. I've got a few lined up that we're working on right now. I really want to hear this story. A gentleman I'm going to have on here pretty soon, 32 North Vietnamese SAMs shot at he and his 4-ship in 2.5 minutes. We're going to have him on pretty soon, and some others. So once again, thanks for coming by, supporting the Lessons from the Cockpit show. Thanks for downloading. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next week on the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I'm your host, Mark Hasara. Have a great week.